If It's the Last Thing I'd Do, by Joshua Wagner. You may call me Jim. My crew long ago adopted a much more rough-and-tumble moniker, but for you, the reader, Jim will suffice. My tale begins with me, at the time not but a humble first mate, on a cargo vessel carrying a shipment of gold galleon and bars set for the colonies from England. Or I believe they prefer to be referred to as the States now, after that bit of unpleasantness that they had with the Crown. I think it might have been started over someone being shot at a tea party. However, I am not a political man, so I cannot say for certain. I had made this voyage with little incident thrice in my time, and had no reason to suspect any different of this undertaking. But as is the way of the sea, no sooner did we have the shore on the horizon that a storm began to brew. The squall bearing down, the captain was faced with the decision to stand fast and weather it, or to weigh anchor in hopes of riding the strong wind to beat it to land. He opted to make an effort for land. Hard choice to be sure. But the storm was on our ship much faster than any of us among the crew had seen before. During the ensuing chaos, we were unable to lower the sails in time and lost the entire mast. Even with all hands at the task, we only just managed to cut it free before the thing capsized the vessel. The mizzenmast was splintered as well, but would be serviceable until we arrived at port as long as the mainmast was replaced to bear some of the load. Once the ocean calmed, one of the barrelmen called out that he spotted land. An island from his description. So the captain ordered us to raise sail on the remaining masts and make for it. We were to go ashore and scout for a tree possibly large enough to substitute our lost main mast until we were able to berth the ship properly to be repaired. As the captain boarded his dinghy, he spoke over us.
"All right, you filthy lot of bilge rats! You better find me the most beautiful tree I've ever set me eyes upon. If you even ponder setting foot back on my boat without it, you'll be spending the night with the captain's daughter."
We all responded with an uproarious laughter. The captain probably threatened us more and made good on them less than any captain that has ever sailed. I think that is why we all admired him. He was a salty man, more likely hewn from stone by his mother than birthed. But he treated each and every one of his crew as if they were born from the same womb. So we set out to obey his order and bring him not but the finest of timber from his mast. Once we landed, we were met by a tribe of aborigines who had apparently been observing us from the tree line. Fortunately, the captain, being the shrewd man that he is, made sure to always have a man aboard who spoke as many of the native languages as possible. From what he told us, they were speaking Abenaki, so we must have been blown north of our destination. The linguist then explained the reason for our intrusion. Once he was finished, the man who seemed to be in authority over the rest told us we were welcome to any tree we like, but that he did not think that one of the size we needed could be found on the island. The captain then instructed the linguist that we saw from the crow's nest there might be larger trees on the far side of the island, and that we would endeavor to make this trek if they would allow it. Upon mention of this, there fell a nervousness across the aborigines as they exchanged looks of apprehension between them. After conversing with the linguist, he turned and explained to us that they did not consider the far side part of the island, and that they all knew to stay away from the woods of that area. They believed many evils dwelled there. We were told if we were to venture into that place, that we would be beyond their protection, and that they would not be able to help after that. As it would happen, our captain was possibly the only man to ever sail who lacked any semblance of superstition. He simply gave a sizable grin, taking off his ornate red overcoat and offered it to the leader of the group of natives. He then told the linguist to thank him for his generosity before ordering the landing party to make ready for our expedition to the other side. The man nodded in acceptance, taking the coat and tying the arms around his waist like a sash.
"Ha! That's one way to do it!" the captain laughed. "Now all you lazy pigs that freeload on my ship, get moving!"
We did make an effort to find what we were looking for before reaching this far side of the island, but with no success. Upon reaching the point in which the average size of the trees began to enlarge, we elected to separate. Each individual would search the tall woods and tie a lash to the largest, straightest tree they could find. after which they would return to the area of the shore we landed. After that, the carpenters would decide which one was best, fell it, then floated around the island back to the ship once the limbs had been removed. To complete the new mast and the yards would take time. I argued that the carpenters could have just easily found the right tree themselves, and that our aimless wandering through taboo forest was entirely unnecessary. But the captain explained that they had a hard job ahead of them, and that,
if we could save them a spot of toil by finding all the good trees for them, then we ought to. It'd be the proper Christian thing to do.
At this we all had a chuckle, as it was well known that the captain was a godless heathen if there ever was one. As I wandered through the dense wood, carefully inspecting the prospects as I went, my ears were met with the distant sounds of splashing water. Taking a moment from my arborist task, I allowed my curiosity to lead me towards the noise. Once I exited the tree line into the light, I could make out that it was a small waterfall I had found, one which poured into a splendid lagoon that gleamed beautifully in the sun. As I leaned down to splash the cool water all over my face, something large suddenly swam past me underneath the surface. Startled, I fell over onto my back in alarm. It wasn't a fish, for the shape nor way it swam did not match. Quickly I scrambled back to my knees, leaning over the edge of the bank to catch another glimpse of the thing. However, it did not return. After exhausting the extent of the time I could waste, I surrendered to disappointment and left the lagoon to tie my tree of choice and returned to the shore. The next day, the ship's carpenters began their work. The captain suggested any who weren't vital to the task at hand gather some of their goods so that they might visit the locals and engage in some bartering. In part as a mission of goodwill, and in part to get the rest of us out of the carpenter's hair. I had very few possessions myself, other than my cutlass and pistol, which were indispensable should we be set upon by French privateers that plagued the crossing. I had only a few small knickknacks I could part with. Upon reaching the village, we were accosted by a gang of pawing children, who tugged at and investigated our various effects and clothing that must have looked quite outlandish to them if this place did not get many European visitors. The rest of the villagers, noticing the commotion caused by the children, came soon after to greet us once again. The linguist explained the nature of our visit and the captain's behest, and once they heard this, most of them returned to their shelters, retrieving various items to present to us. Before I had the chance to do any dealing of my own, the captain grabbed me by my baldric and pulled me off to the side to join him with the linguist. We stood in front of the man who the captain had given his coat the previous day. He, who was still wearing the coat around his waist as a sash, I was told was the chief. With him was his daughter, who was also a high priestess of the village. The chief was, for a lack of a better description, cut from the exact same cloth as the captain. I could tell they were getting along famously as the linguist passed words back and forth between the two. He told us that he was happy that we had all returned safely from the other end of the island, but still neglected to divulge what about the other side made it a place to be avoided. As they conversed, the chief's daughter reached down and took the carved whale's tooth from my hand, which I had been holding in anticipation of trading moments ago. It was a simple trinket I obtained some years ago on a trip to the Orient. It was a large tooth that had many beautiful flowers carved onto the side of it, and a regal tiger on the other. I observed her as she turned the ivory in her hands, scrutinizing every small facet and detail. She was of a beauty to which I was unaccustomed. From her night-black hair to her obsidian eyes to her bronze skin, even to what appeared to be a vine of some sort tattooed across the brim of her nose. Most men from back in England would find such markings more than a little appalling. I, however, never adorned such sentiments. I even had a few seaworthy tattoos myself. After a few moments, I had the linguist tell her that it was hers to keep. She seemed more fond of it than I had ever been, and I had no need of it. Her face alighted with such surprise and joy, she bounded back to her hut as fast as her legs would allow, quickly returning with something else clutched in her hands. She presented me with the object, which was an astonishingly intricate necklace made of beads so small it was difficult to tell they were beads at all. Carved from what looked like to be rare gemstones, they gleamed marvelously in the sunlight, and were woven together to form various complex patterns and symbols across it. She then spoke to the linguist a message for me. As she placed it in my hand, he said, "She says that as long as you keep this land will grant you a long and healthy life." I wanted to refuse, as it was far too precious a thing to exchange for something as common as a carved whale tooth. But, as many places I have been, I know well that it would be terribly rude to refuse anything from someone of her stature. I thanked her, placing it around my neck, proudly and gratefully. As time progressed and the mingling continued, I began to think back to the lagoon and the strange creature from yesterday. I waited until the crew began to return to the ship, and once the crowd's attention was elsewhere, I made my way off into the woods once again. It took me some time to gain my bearings, but once my surroundings began to look familiar, I determined which way I needed to head to return to the lagoon. Exiting the tree line, I surveyed the environment for the strange beast, but saw nothing. I made my way to the bank and peered into the haze of rippling water, hoping to spot the thing. I waited like this for what must have been an hour, though I could not be sure as I did not have a time glass nor a clock on hand to keep count. Discouraged, I resolved to return each day. We remained at the island until I was able to lay my eyes on the creature. But at the time the sun was threatening to fall behind the trees, I needed light to find my way back to the ship. But before I was able to leave, I began to hear a young man's voice approaching from the woods. An English voice. It was faint, but I could hear it just well enough to be certain it was a young man speaking English. But it was no voice I knew from the ship, and I was well familiar with each of the crewmen. This was not one of them. A near lifetime on sea had made me cautious, so I took cover in the bush, being sure to remain quiet and out of sight. As the young man entered the clearing, I was able to discern to whom he was speaking. A boy, no older than 10 or 11. He said to the boy, "I understand. Everyone is nervous the first time they play the game, but there's nothing to worry about. You're going to be fine. Just relax and follow me." The boy complied and followed him to the water's edge. "Now, you see that cave behind the waterfall?" he asked, pointing towards the cascade of water. The boy shook his head. "Oh, well, look closer," the young man said, lifting a large stone over the distracted boy's head as he spoke.
Wait, what in God's name are you doing?
I shouted, jumping from behind my cover, causing them to both look in my direction. The young man suddenly brought the rock down on the boy's skull. I heard the impact and saw the eyes roll into the back of their sockets before he crumpled to the ground unconscious.
What is wrong with you? Are you mad? Why would you do that?
I screamed at the assailant as I attempted to run to the boy's aid, but before I could reach him, the young man sprinted towards me. I tried to draw my cutlass in an attempt to defend myself, but he was fast, faster than any man I had ever seen in all my years fighting aboard ships and on docks and in ports across the world. I was unable to keep sight on him as he was behind me before I had a chance to react. I felt a sharp blow against the back of my head which dropped me to my knees. I tried to draw my pistol with my left hand, but I was beginning to fade in and out of consciousness. Then everything went black. I came to just in time to see him kick my severed hand, still grasping my pistol, into the water with a snicker as he held a large and bloody dagger in his hand. Still unable to move, I could only watch in horror as he walked over to the boy. He bent down, took the barely breathing child in his lapel, and began to drag him across the grass to a large flat boulder. He then hoisted the boy up onto the flat stone before raising his dagger high and plunging it down hard into his chest. The soft rising and fall of the poor boy's breath fell still. My vision continued to falter, but I could still see what happened next, even as the world began to darken. As the child died, a multitude of glowing orbs began to appear from behind the trees, and from behind the waterfall, and from the sky, and from all directions, descending onto the boy's body and to his murderer. As the tens and thousands of floating lights encircled them, everything faded away at once. A terrible cry of pain brought me back to the waking world. Summoning all my strength, I struggled to right myself. My head spun as I remembered what transpired and began searching for signs of the man and the boy's body, but they were not to be found. Another wail of agony broke through the sound of running water and crickets as the twilight began to take hold. The crew. I needed to get back to my crew. It was the only driving thought in my mind. The only thing pulling me forward as I stumbled and tripped through the woods in the failing light. Each scream cracking through the trees only serving to quicken my pace as I held my bleeding stump of a hand in my bunched-up vest. As I fell through the brush onto the sand of the beach, I felt my insides lurch. The shouts and cries had gone silent long before I was able to make my way to the shore. I vomited the entire contents of my stomach as my gaze rested on the butchered remains of the crewman who came ashore with me. I could see lamps in the distance as the remaining crew on the ship rowed towards me on the last few dinghies. My knees gave way, and as I lied there bleeding to death, a crewman's oil lamp managed to cast just enough light to illuminate the body nearest to me. I stared into the lifeless eyes of my captain as I surrendered myself to the other side. I awoke days later to a throbbing headache. I was in a hut that I deduced must have been in the natives' village. About the time I noticed a familiar ivory trinket on a shelf across the room, I felt something cool and wet being pressed gingerly against my forehead. The chief's daughter was holding a wet rag to my head. She held me down as I tried to sit up, instead taking my right hand gesturing for me to hold the rag against my head. She then left the hut for a few moments and returned with the linguist and a few of the remaining crew. I could tell some of them had been recently crying, as their eyes were bloodshot and the marks of salty tears still stained their cheeks. I asked the linguist how he managed to survive, and he explained once the chaos began to ensue, the captain flipped a dinghy over on top of him to hide him away, as the captain knew the poor man was far from a fighting sort of any kind. He and the rest of the crewmen began to tell me what transpired from their own perspectives, and then I recounted the events of my own to the best of my ability. Finally, I was allowed to sit up myself. As I sat on the edge of the cot, the high priestess daughter of the chief began to speak, and as she did, the linguist translated for her. I was able to stop the bleeding on your head and arm, but I could not give you back your hand. That is beyond my ability. I have done my best. I have taken from each of your fallen men what your man of two words has told me is what you call a piece of 8. Since the Spanish dollar was accepted almost everywhere in the world, every member of the crew made it a habit to at least keep one silver coin on him in case a dire need should arise. They continued, I have taken these and made the metal into something to replace your stolen hand. I looked down for the first time to the place where my left hand was. It was now wrapped in several layers of slightly bloodied cloth. I began to unravel the first layer, but before I could, a native man walked into the hut and spoke to the priestess. She then spoke to the linguist, who then relayed the message to me. The chief would like to speak to you. He asks if you would allow him to enter. It is a custom for the people here to always ask permission before entering a grieving person's room. He added after seeing the look of shock that the chief would ever need my permission to enter a dwelling in his own village. I said of course, and the linguist stepped out and invited him in. As he entered, everyone except the linguist laughed. He began asking how I felt and told me that we were his guests for as long as we needed. After that, he untied the coat the captain gave him on the first day and wrapped it around his shoulders, the brilliant red velvet feeling much heavier on me than any coat ever should. He then invited me to walk with him through the village. As we walked, he told us the story of the man who made the deal with the great evil, about the man who traded the souls of children in exchange for eternal youth and unnatural abilities, about how the man came to the people of his tribe, demanding that they share with him their secrets of long life, about how he threatened the chief when he banished him from his home, about the child army that the man keeps on the far side of the island, preparing to destroy the village at the first opportunity, about how the land keeps them safe as long as the High Priestess remains on the island, and they never venture into the dark parts of the forest on the other side. The man would bring unwanted children to the island from the colonies and indoctrinate them into thinking murder was just another game to be played, and once they began to get too old, he would offer their lives up to the great evil in exchange for his youth and power. He told us the entirety of this story, even the name they had given him, and then he did something I did not expect. He started to weep. The chief fell to his knees and took my hand. The linguist translated. "I am so sorry. I should not have sent you away from the island. I have made an awful mistake. I only wish to help you, but I have caused the death of your men and your chief. And even your hand is because of me." I bent down and raised the man off of the ground. I told him that it was my fault, not his. If I had stayed away from the lagoon, none of this would have happened and all my shipmates would have still been with us. They paid the price for my curiosity, and I told him that I would make the man pay for everything he had ever done. I told him this as I unwrapped the cloth covering where my missing appendage once had been, revealing the gleaming silver hand now fused to my arm by some unknown means. A long silver talon stretching from each of the permanently grasping fingers. Running my fingers over the embossed patterns that still remained from the coins which had once belonged to my dearest friends, I examined it for a moment before holding my head high to stare into the deep, dark woods once more. And in a wave of absolute, unyielding hatred, I felt a single tear roll down my cheek as I spoke my solemn oath into the trees. "I'll get you for this, Pan, if it's the last thing I do."